Testing. Whoa. So friends, can you hear me? We're going to have to talk somewhat emphatically. Is everybody ready? Okay, so we'll get started here. I'm Tom Athanasiou, and I'm a partner in the Climate Equity Reference Project, which is also one of the founders of the Civil Society Equity Review, and I'm very pleased to be here today for this panel in which we're going to give you an overview of this year's review. But first, let me give you a quick history of the Civil Society Equity Review. Could we have two slides, please? 2 slides. So, as you can see, this is not the first Civil Society Equity Review. We started the project before Paris when a group of us realized that the equity assessment of the NDCs, an assessment which the parties were absolutely not willing or able to do, would be necessary if we were going to achieve anything like equity and ambition. And in other words, we reached the conclusion that civil society was going to have to do its own equity assessment of the NDCs. After long debates, which I will not trouble you with, it was decided these assessments would be based on the work of the Climate Equity Reference Project. And after Paris, it was decided that we had to extend the analysis beyond the equity assessment of NDCs themselves. Since then, we've hit a lot of topics, but we've always included in every report an assessment of the NDCs themselves in equity terms. Christian, so for that reason, Christian Holtz, who's going to be the first speaker, is going to give a very brief summary of the equity assessment of the NDCs that is in this year's report. And then we're going to go on to the meat and potatoes, or the broiled tofu, or whatever form of protein you prefer. And we're going to talk about the imperative of international cooperation. The imperative of international cooperation. And looking at the world as we have it today, it should be pretty obvious why we've chosen this topic. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and they all have a lot to say. Alas, they have a maximum of 10 minutes each, and I've asked them to try to stick to 8. And I hope to be organized enough to harass them at 9. So first up will be Christian Holtz, who, like me, is a partner in the Climate Equity Reference Project. Kristen is also a part-time professor at Carleton University in Canada and a long-time climate equity activist. He's going to take us quickly through the equity assessment of the NDCs. Second up is Sindra Sharma, who is a policy officer for Climate Action Network International and a general wonder of competence and congeniality. She's going to speak to the challenges of effective international cooperation within the UNFCCC process. Next up will be Colin Besans, who is a program manager with PowerShift Africa, a Kenya-based nonprofit working on African climate and energy policy. His work is focused on equitable fossil fuel phase-out, 100% renewable energy pathways, and alternative development approaches. He's going to introduce the particular challenges that have to be faced and faced down if we're to achieve effective international cooperation in the African context. Please don't be surprised if he has something to say about fossil gas. Rebecca Byers, I hope I have that right, is Deputy Director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and also leads on the initiative's research strategy and global registry of fossil fuels. Prior to taking on that role, she specialized in energy and just transition policy with the government of New South Wales in Australia. She has the rather daunting job of quickly introducing the challenges of international cooperation on initiatives and multilateral platforms designed to address financing, renewable energy build-out, and the challenges of a fair fossil fuel phase-out. Victor Minotti, the second last speaker, is a long-term campaigner against neoliberal globalization, is currently a senior researcher at the Oakland Institute, though he's actually living and working in Slovakia. He's going to give us a quick introduction to the international cooperation challenges that would be posed by the need to manage energy market instability during a rapid fossil fuel phase-out. It goes without saying, or should, that unless energy price stability is properly contained, there can be no possibility of such a fair phase-out. And finally, Nidhi Nagpal, who is a veteran debt justice and climate justice campaigner, and indeed a foundation stone on the global climate justice movement. She's our final speaker, and as befits that position, is going to take on some of the big questions that don't get nearly enough airtime inside the UNFCCC bubble. The challenges of international cooperation towards changing the rules and architecture of global trade, investment, finance, and technology. And with that introduction and this rather challenging context, I will turn this over to Christian.
Feminists speak out next door. We can't compete, so. It's the Feminist Speak Out next door. That's the event.
Very good. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks, Tom. So as Tom already mentioned, in all these reports, one thing that they have in common is that we assessed the NDCs, or rather the mitigation content of the NDCs against our analysis of what the fair shares of countries should be on mitigation. Can we have the next slide? This is surprisingly distracting.
I'm sure if they know there's another event going on here, they will respectfully.
Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, so this is just to tell you or to show you. So our NDC analysis or our fair shares analysis is based on, as Tom already mentioned, the climate equity reference framework, and that in turn is based on the principles that are embedded in the UNFCCC in the convention. And this is just to show you how that is, conceptually coming all from the articles of the convention. And specifically when we think about fair shares, we ensure that we define a global goal mitigation effort that reflects the precautionary approach to adequacy, and that we take the people's rights to sustainable development and indeed life in dignity and without poverty into proper account. So that's the basic fundamental principles of the approach. And how we do that specifically is by excluding the emissions and the incomes of the poorest, or treating them differently than those of the richest, and differently again from those that are neither poor nor rich. Yeah, and then in doing this, we embrace the convention principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities when we consider how much countries, or through which we consider, we do that by considering how much countries have contributed to creating the climate crisis via their greenhouse gas emissions, and then by looking how much financial wherewithal they have at their disposal, again considering differently the incomes of the poorest and the richest to address the climate emergency. And the climate equity reference framework is a flexible fair shares framework, and that allows users to change the parameters to match their specific understanding of what they consider fair. And in fact, one of the reasons why we created this framework is to allow people to sort of explore this problem space of understanding how responsibility and capability affects the question. Can you advance the slides? No? Thank you. So when we use these calculations, and now there's a few clicks. Can you click again? Can you click one more time? One more time? And one more time, just to get them all done. All right, so this would have been the interactive part. So when we use we can use these considerations to calculate which share of the global emission reductions that need to be done each country is responsible for, or should be responsible for, in proportion to their share of the global responsibility and capability. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a chart from the report, and so we did these calculations, the fair shares calculations for all countries in the world. But for the current report, we wanted to focus just on a few countries, and so here we show some developed countries and some developing countries from Africa, because we are in Africa, but they are generally speaking representative of developing countries and developed countries respectively. And so here is the chart from the report that shows for these countries that we've selected how our calculations of their fair share compared to the mitigation pledges that they've put forward in their NDCs. So the one thing to note here, which is a little bit unusual in our reports compared to what you normally see, is that we express these emission reductions in per capita terms as reductions below 2030 baseline emissions per person, right? And so we do that in per person terms, so we can easily compare between countries of different sizes. The horizontal green bar that you see for each country shows our result for these countries' fair share reductions. And unsurprisingly, the more a country has contributed to climate change and the bigger a country's economy, the larger its per capita fair share of mitigation would be. So that's why in fact, if you look closely, you even have a different scale on the left than on the right, for the left two countries than the right two countries. So they are quite different indeed. And then the black horizontal lines show you the mitigation that is in the NDCs, and the arrows show you the shortfall or the exceedance, and the labels next to the arrows. If it's red, it's a shortfall. If it's green, it's an exceedance. So we can see some clear pattern here. The wealthier countries in this chart fall way short of their fair shares. The US and the EU that are shown there have pledged about a third to half of their fair share in mitigation, while on the other hand, the developing countries that are shown there by and large exceed our fair share calculation in their NDC. And South Africa, for example, deserves a special mention because they actually explicitly used our civil society equity review methodology and the climate equity reference calculator to to justify why they figure their NDC is fair and ambitious. Maybe not surprisingly, then their NDC ends up being assessed as fair in our methodology. Can I have next slide, please? Thank you. So now one thing that's important to note here that, and this is not in the chart, in the report I just added it here to explain this point, is that for wealthier countries, even if they were to substantially increase their emission, and even if they increase their emission to such a degree that it would totally eliminate their emissions by 2030, they would still fall short of their fair share, right? So we can see here, you can see this here where even an ambitious domestic pathway or even full decarbonization would not meet the full fair share. However, these countries are still morally responsible for contributing their full fair share and not just the contribution or the portion that they can achieve through domestic reductions. So the shortfall, which often is quite substantial and often more or equal to the amount that they would do at home, has to be contributed through the provision of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building or other means of supporting other countries. In other words, cooperation, right? International cooperation. Because, next slide please. Because the reverse is true in the less wealthy countries. So even if they meet their fair share, or if they pledge to meet their fair share, with many of them already do, they unfortunately have to do even more in terms of the mitigation that has to take place in these countries. So we have highlighted that from our very first report in 2015, that this is one of the fundamental and structural injustices of this moment that we are in the climate crisis. But we cannot really avoid, and the only thing we can do at this point in time is avoid making this injustice more grave by at least paying or otherwise supporting and cooperating on this additional mitigation that goes beyond those countries' own fair share. And so that is, illustrated here as this gray wedge that is between the fair share and what actually needs to be done in the country. Next slide, please. So in other words, what our analysis consistently since 2015 and over 7 years, consistently year by year shows is that collectively countries have not done or have not pledged enough mitigation. So all countries have to pledge more. In the wealthiest countries, they have to do more in terms of domestic mitigation, very, very important. And much, much more in terms of international cooperation, finance, support, technology, and so on. And in the less wealthy countries, on the other hand, they must, and again, many of them already do, make pledges that at least meet their fair share, but then also have to be, and again, that's like this fundamental injustice that we're in right now, or that we're facing right now, have to be willing to go even beyond that through cooperation, with cooperation and climate finance, technology transfer, support, and so on. And as I said, it's and so this is since we've been finding the same thing for 7 years. We have that cooperation is kind of at the core of solving this conundrum. We have decided this year to focus on international cooperation in this report, and so this is sort of like the reason why we focused on that, because we, in our NDC analysis and in our fair shares analysis of the NDC, we consistently find that international cooperation is absolutely crucial and not just an afterthought in getting to the ambition that we need. And can you do the next slide? And one more? And then you can switch the thing off, I guess, and put the speakers on. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being part of this panel. So thanks for the invitation as well. And I'm going to follow on and talk a little bit about the UNFCCC and the processes there as well. So, as Christian already mentioned, equity is a gateway to ambition. It's a foundational principle of the Convention and its Paris Agreement, and goes beyond the UNFCCC and the rules of the global climate regime as well. And this is a place where we should be really talking about international cooperation and solidarity. So the principle of CBDR RC is pretty clear. Developed countries take the lead in emissions reductions. Developing countries have developmental imperatives as well, and their ability to undertake climate actions depends on the extent of support they receive from developed countries, and this should be fulfilled according to a setting of rights and obligations. So somewhere down the line, however, there's been a little bit of a failure to deliver this cooperation and solidarity that is so needed to respond to the crisis we're in. And actually, we see this playing out in the negotiations today in a manner that continues to waste precious time. And we see that in some of the conversations around finance and pretty much across the board. So we have seen in the most recent IPCC and synthesis reports that there is a mismatch between action and ambition. And the scale of the challenge is actually quite immense, as Christian already showed in his presentation. And it might feel insurmountable, but it's not, because we have the systems and processes in place to be able to deal with it. And wealthy polluters, if they paid up their historic responsibility, did their fair shares, we would get to where we need to go to. So I'll give you an example of climate finance under the UNFCCC. We're still talking about billions when we really need to be shifting and talking about the trillions. The first needs determination report of the Standing Committee of Finance, which only looked at 78 developing country NDCs, summed the climate-related needs by developing countries as, and for those reported in NDCs, that could, only those needs that could be costed, at around 6 trillion through to 2030. The costs of actions included in the biennial update reports amount to 11 trillion. And these are underestimates because they're based on just 78 countries. So, and only the costed needs as well, right? So we still talk about the 100 billion as well, which in itself, it needs to be delivered, but in its very decision, it excluded developing country voices as well, and it's based on sort of a principle, rather than equity and fair shares, injustice and immorality. So the percentage of the so-called climate finance delivered as loans over grants as well is 70%, and the percentage of finance going to adaptation is just 6 to 7%, when we need to be seeing a doubling and a 50% share. So the percentage of finance to address loss and damage is 0%. And the adaptation gap report this year said it all, said it very well, just in its title. It said, too little, too slow. So if we consider the case of Vanuatu allocates 15% of its recurrent budget to climate impacts. And here we're still talking about pennies or for impacts, or no money at all in the case of loss and damage. Capacity building is also a key enabler and can be strengthened across the board, across issues. The Paris Committee on Capacity Building, which addresses current and emerging gaps and needs in implementing and further enhancing capacity building in developing countries, and the capacity building hub that's associated with it. And there's several other processes that are scattered across the board, including the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, the Transparency Framework, the CTCN. They all offer this sort of tool for capacity building, but these need to be a little bit strengthened to be able to be relevant to context and needs-driven as well. So really it's about strengthening and orienting the needs and utility in a better manner. So again, we have the processes, it's about utilizing them. Now, as this is an implementation COP, Article 6.8 on non-market mechanisms offers an opportunity through match support, which can enable South countries to invest more proactively in their sustainable and renewable energy futures, and just transition, which is an extremely important item on the agenda on the Paris Agreement's agenda has not actually been given the space to be appropriately addressed, and it mainly falls under the forum on the impact of the implementation of response measures. So, noting the importance of this issue, it'd be great if it had its own sort of substantial space to be discussed. And then we have the GST, which is extremely vital and grounded in equity. And this is what the Paris Agreement also hinges on. So this ratchet of ambition can only work if equity is foremost. We just concluded the GST sessions yesterday, the technical dialogues, and this was quite a positive and inclusive process, and it did lead to a bit of guidance around the political tie-in, which is going to be essential for progress next year, and it's about ensuring that equity remains forefront in those discussions as well. And finally, a very key element, one that was mandated at COP26, is to deliver and define an ambitious and equitable mitigation work program. And again, as we saw through Christian's presentation of the fair share benchmarks, the reason that we need this work program is because we're clearly not on track. And we need to be able to get back on track. So this is to facilitate that. The objective of the work program should therefore be to urgently enhance the ambition and implementation efforts of parties to be able to deliver us to 1.5 degrees. And also, as we saw with the IPCC, we would need emissions reductions across all sectors and countries in a manner that is just and equitable. So this is where international cooperation and solidarity really hinges on being able to deliver this in a manner that supports all of us to get to that transformative, deeply decarbonized world that we need to see. And currently, the status of the mitigation work program negotiations, which is occurring now, is a little bit non-committal. We have heavily bracketed text, which has a host of options that don't necessarily speak to each other. But we know as civil society that a robust mitigation work program would need a political tie-in with the ministerial roundtables, which start Monday, on 2030 ambition, and the GST can offer a long-term check-in to ensure that we remain on track. So we have these sets of solutions through these mechanisms I've spoken of in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and it's just a matter of ensuring that they're delivered in the first instance in relation to finance especially, and the mitigation work program, and then to maintain the frame of equity, accountability, and fair shares throughout that. And so to conclude, this will not occur unless equity and fair shares are at its very center. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sindra, and thanks everyone for being here. So my amazing colleagues on the left are going to speak a lot more to the actual mechanisms of international cooperation that we want to, have people start discussing and working on and getting out there. But before we get into that detail, I'm going to speak a bit about the African context into which this is playing and the political context of this COP specifically that this cooperation discussion happens in. So I'm Colin Basance. I'm a South African. I work with PowerShift Africa, which is based in Nairobi. And we work on climate and energy policy kind of across Africa. And what we're seeing right now is a pretty clear battle for narrative that's going down at this COP. And that narrative is being generated, the battle is being played out on whether or not cooperation is happening. And in that narrative fight, there are two camps. On the one side, we have international fossil fuel interests who, through richer governments, multinational companies, and selected African elites, are making a play to use this COP to capture and secure a future for fossil fuels in Africa under the guise of energy access and a right to development. On the other camp, we have African civil society and communities who for decades have been calling for a better future and whose right to development and whose right to a better life is ironically being denied by that very same lobby that claims to be the ones fighting for development. So to give a little sense of how that has played out over the last year, in Glasgow we had an announcement about an end for overseas fossil fuel finance. And this really spooked a lot of the lobby who were pretty clear that if there was going to be any time left to kick off new projects and secure fossil fuel expansion across Africa, that time was now. And so over the last few months, a series of a systematic plan has played out. So we had the SE for All Summit in Rwanda, which in theory should be about sustainable energy for all and should be pursuing the renewable energy solutions of the future. If you look at the communique that came out of that summit, point 2 was about securing gas expansion across the African continent. Following SE for All, we caught wind of a paper that had been put together by a technical committee under the AU made up of energy and transport ministers who had put together a proposal for a common position on energy transition and energy access. And in that plan, front and center, while there were many of the right words, many of the greenwash terms that we love to hear, there was also a very clear push to secure fossil gas and nuclear as the future plan for Africa's energy system. Following that communique and that proposal, we then had the Africa Energy Week a few weeks ago in Cape Town. And here, while Africa Energy Week sounds like a lovely thing that we should get behind, if you look at the attendees, it is very much the Africa Fossil Lobby Week, where fossil fuel companies and ministers from across the continent get together to discuss their plans. And there, not only was there explicit statements made that now is the time to secure the future for fossil fuels in Africa, not only was this said very openly, but people even joked that they had told that we even heard petroleum ministers joking that they had told their environmental ministers that they better walk the line when they get to COP27. And so this institutional capture trying to secure fossils across the continent is happening very clearly, but it's not happening in a vacuum. Parallel to this, there's a narrative capture at play. And this is where the international cooperation discussion comes in. Because narratively, there's a very powerful argument coming from that side. What they're saying is, for decades, rich countries have emitted, they're responsible for the climate catastrophe we now face, they refuse to cooperate, they refuse to pay up, they owe a massive climate debt, and they're hypocrites to tell Africa what to do. Every piece of that part of the narrative is true. The problem is, they're then making the jump at the end to say, therefore, we need to secure fossil fuel expansion across the continent because that's the best way forward. And that's where everything breaks down. Because that hypocrisy is absolutely true. The fact that rich countries owe Africa a massive climate debt is absolutely true. But the conclusion that that means that fossils are our best way is just a radically, massive logical leap with no real basis. What is true is that an alternative future for Africa is very possible. 100% renewable future is very possible. There are already models and case studies that show this for specific countries that continue to go ignored. There are plans from countries and communities calling for a renewable future. But when those calls are made, people are told, oh, well, we need an all hands on deck approach. We need all things. And actually, you know what? Gas will be the transition fuel. It'll help us transition. Now, if there's anything that the economic and political realities of the strength of the fossil fuel lobby have shown us in every other country, it's that building more fossil fuels does nothing but lock you into more fossil fuels. It makes it more profitable, it secures the industry, it increases profits flowing to the lobby, and it makes sure that those interests are solidified. On the other hand, Africa now has the chance to leapfrog. We have the opportunity to go a different direction, to embrace the technology of the future, to adopt cell phones rather than building out a fixed line. But if I told you that building out fixed line infrastructure would help you get to a cell phone, you'd probably think I was pretty silly. Unfortunately, the same argument is being peddled across the continent. But the reason that this narrative is being effective is because this right to development, this idea that there is no way for Africa to develop without fossil fuels, is not being effectively countered with real international cooperation that shows that another way is possible. And this is the problem. A better future is very possible for Africa, but without international cooperation, it will continue to be too easy for the fossil fuel lobby. It will be too easy for them to take what happens here and continue to perpetuate their interests in the African continent. And the irony here is the same people that benefit from not paying up here are the people who benefit from the idea that them not paying up here means that they should be allowed to continue expanding fossil fuels elsewhere. That's the true insanity of this system, is that they haven't been accountable here, and now we're allowing that lack of accountability to justify their expansion across a whole new continent. So clearly we can't let this happen. Clearly we have to fight for an alternative. I'm just checking my time. We have to make sure that we do secure a better future. But that's not going to happen by ignoring the fossil fuel lobby, the biggest delegation here at COP. And it's not going to happen without lifting up the voices of those who have been fighting across the African continent for a better future for decades. It is going to happen by very rapid, full-scale investment into an alternative renewable energy future, one that I believe could happen in part even with domestic mobilization and rethinking of development models within Africa and South-South self-reliance and sovereignty. But it will not happen as fast as it needs to, or nearly as effectively, without the international cooperation that my colleagues will now take us through. And not only is that international cooperation needed in order to make things happen economically, but narratively, if we don't see that cooperation, we just make it far too easy for the fossil fuel lobby to secure their future time and time again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. All right, hopefully you can hear me. I'll move a bit closer to the microphone. There we go. Excellent. Can you guys hear that feedback? Okay, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to say that was incredibly powerful, Colin, and thank you so much. And I have the pleasure now of speaking about some of those international cooperation mechanisms that we hope will address some of those challenges. I also wanted to say a huge thank you to the authors of the report and those who've been working on it, because I think it's an incredibly clear and incisive and practical summary of what we should be thinking about and what equity means when we come to the multilateral process. So I'll be talking through some of the international cooperation mechanisms that we can use outside of the UNFCCC process, while also emphasizing, of course, that we're all here at COP and we shouldn't be taking any pressure off this space. But what we can do is also work through complementary mechanisms to the UNFCCC. So the report categorizes these mechanisms into three broad buckets. The first being finance, the second being just transition, and the third focusing on the fossil fuel phase out. On the finance piece, we heard from Sindra earlier that it's not just about achieving the $100 billion goal that's included under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but we need to be mobilizing trillions. So obviously we're not anywhere near reaching that through the UNFCCC process. And recently there have been some really interesting proposals outside of the UNFCCC, a whole range of proposals that are on the table and that are gaining traction here at COP as well. These include things like windfall profit taxes, financial transactions tax, taxes on carbon and aviation, wealth taxes. Obviously debt cancellation policies is a major one. And another proposal that's really drawn out in the report is the proposal that Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, has put forward, which is calling the Bridgetown Initiative, which is essentially to use IMF special drawing rights to, as a new bucket of money for climate finance. So her proposal is that using the existing infrastructure of the IMF could increase its special drawing rights allocation by $500 billion a year for the next 20 years. She points out that that's only 2% of the money that the IMF has, or that central banks have mobilized for quantitative easing over the past 13 years. it's a drop in the ocean when it comes to the money that exists in the international financial system, but is 5 times the amount that we haven't even managed to achieve here through the UNFCCC process. So it would be a major step up. There are obviously challenges when it comes to the IMF. The US has a veto power, for example, on all IMF decisions. The way special drawing rights work is that they're actually allocated on the basis of the size of an economy rather than on need. So wealthy countries actually end up receiving more money under this kind of process. And it would require wealthy countries to change the way that special drawing rights are currently allocated to enable this. But we are seeing this gain momentum. We've seen Emmanuel Macron of France, and we've seen Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF herself support the proposal. So we are starting to see this, I guess, gain some support of wealthy nations. And it's the kind of initiative that has the capacity to actually mobilize money that's getting towards the scale that we need, although of course it's not going to solve the entire problem. In terms of the just transition bucket of proposals in the international cooperation chapter of the report, there's a really excellent example which I know many of the colleagues in this room have been working on. The report emphasises the need for global South-led initiatives, and the Least Developed Countries Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Initiative is a really key example of that. So this was launched several years ago by the 46 least developed countries, which is the group of the 46 poorest countries in the world. And this is an initiative that's been proposed by the LDCs for the LDCs. It maps out a pathway towards leapfrogging, like Colin was talking about earlier, leapfrogging ahead to 100% renewable energy, 100% access to energy, and strong targets on energy efficiency across the continent as well. There's a really excellent plan as to how that would look like, and it really builds on not just grid-scale energy, but community-centred and community-owned energy as well, which is a really key part of the initiative. And so we call it the LDC Renewable Energy or Energy Efficiency, or LDC REI for short, I think is a really key example of Global South-led initiatives that actually have tangible plans for how we would transition from fossil fuels to the renewable energy-powered economy that we need. The challenge is that we've seen initiatives like this in the past be co-opted by Western donors and by wealthy nations that have essentially taken up the mantle of the initiative but co-opted the governance and led them astray. So the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, for example, was another really powerful initiative that was launched during Paris. Had a lot of promise. It was involved in a commitment to enable 300 gigawatts of new renewable energy across the continent by 2030. And we've seen that, unfortunately, head in the wrong direction. It hasn't achieved any of the goals that were committed during the Paris conference. The reason for that being that the control of the initiative was taken away from those who had proposed it in the first place. So the report, when it comes to the equity dimension of Global South-led initiatives, really emphasises the importance of strong governance and governance from those in the Global South. The report also proposes a Just Transition Fund that might support such initiatives. And it contrasts the idea of a global just transition fund to current approaches that we're seeing, such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are really gaining traction. Now, you might have heard about these. They're in the media prominently. Last year in Glasgow, there was a proposed deal with South Africa where the US, France, Germany, the UK, US, and EU committed $8.5 billion to help South Africa transition its energy system. Obviously, that would be incredibly exciting if that money were new, additional, and real money. But what we've seen over the past year is that that money is mostly pre-existing pledges and mostly loans. We're seeing similar proposed initiatives in other countries as well. So India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal, Egypt, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, and Morocco are all on the list of countries that may receive similar deals. But the challenge is we don't know what those deals will look like. We don't know if that money is going to be new and additional. There is no transparency mechanism around these kinds of bilateral or plurilateral financing mechanisms. And it really leads to the danger that these just energy transition partnerships become a kind of cherry-picking exercise where powerful nations like the G7 can strategically influence countries in the global south through these deals which we have very little transparency or knowledge around. So the report instead, as an alternative, suggests a multilateral global just transition fund that would actually have strong governance and transparency mechanisms, and we'd be able to understand where the money is going. Of course, this would be a complement to initiatives such as the IMF special drawing rights that it also talks about. And the final bucket of initiatives is the initiatives focused towards fossil fuel phase out. I mean, these are all incredibly interlinked, but there are some really exciting proposals that have been coming forward and that we're starting to see actually exist out in the world when it comes to international cooperation on fossil fuels, and that hopefully will start to address, or those early days, some of the challenges that Colin was talking about. One proposal, so this doesn't exist yet, but is a proposal that's starting to be spoken about more publicly or more frequently, are proposals around paying countries to keep fossil fuels in the ground, essentially finance for countries to develop alternative sources of revenue and alternative energy sources if they do not extract the fossil fuel reserves that they have in the ground, that they have access to. This builds off the Yasuni ITT initiative that was proposed in Ecuador around a decade ago, which unfortunately wasn't effective simply because the money didn't materialize, but was a really interesting idea. Recently, we've heard both Colombia and Timor-Leste ask the international community, if you help fund us to keep our fossil fuels, our oil and gas unextracted, we won't extract it, we will use that money to develop alternative sources of revenue. President Jose Ramos Horta of Timor-Leste said, if you give me $100 billion, which is less than the defence budget of Australia, that will be enough for me to shift my economy away from depending on fossil fuels. 85% of Timor-Leste's budget comes from fossil fuels, to alternative sources of revenue that don't involve extracting those resources. So hopefully that's something that we'll see gain traction, and the report speaks really highly of that approach. We're also starting to see international cooperation from countries that are starting to phase out fossil fuels. So it's quite common in the international system, in the UN space, for initiatives or for actions in a certain area to start or be championed by a club of countries in the first instance. And we're seeing that, for example, with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which was launched last year in Glasgow. It was launched by Denmark and Costa Rica and includes 14 members, including national and subnational governments that have made different levels of commitment. The core members of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance have made commitments to phase out fossil fuels in line with 1.5 degrees. So while it's a small club at the moment with only 14 countries, primarily countries from Europe and several subnational governments, it is a step in the direction of starting to build that norm around fossil fuel phase out and starting to have countries that are championing what this might look like and develop best practice. And that group is starting to grow as well. And I expect we'll see some announcements of new members here at COP. In addition to having clubs of countries come together and start to champion an issue, it's really important to build the evidence base as well. So another proposal, which is being developed right now, okay, I'll wrap up in just a moment. Another proposal is the idea of a global commission on fossil fuels. And so this is the idea that a group of champion countries and high-profile officials, including the UN, might develop a commission that would bring together countries from around the world to develop a knowledge base on what the just transition from fossil fuels would look like. And I'll just conclude by speaking about an initiative that's really personally of interest to me, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a proposal building on all of those building blocks that I've outlined, and really an umbrella for the finance piece and for the keep it in the ground and for the just transition aspects of international cooperation. The idea of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is that it would commit countries to phasing out fossil fuels, ending expansion of fossil fuels, and financing a just transition for fossil fuel-dependent developing countries. At the moment, the campaign has grown incredibly over the past couple of years. There's something like 1,800 organizations, 70 cities, 101 Nobel laureates that are supporting the campaign. We're seeing people at COP actually know what it is, and last year it was a very new idea. We now have 2 countries that are championing the initiative as well. So at the UN General Assembly, Vanuatu became the first country to announce its support for a fossil fuel treaty. And here at COP, just on Tuesday, Tuvalu was the first country to propose a treaty during the UNFCCC process. And the idea of the treaty is it brings all of those things together, and it contributes to the norm and narrative shift. The Campaign for a Treaty helps shift the narrative away from fossil fuels, and the framing of the fossil fuel treaty being that fossil fuels are weapons of mass destruction, we think is really powerful. I will wrap up just to say that there are a huge range of initiatives that we can pursue, and then the Civil Society Equity Review report, I think, paints a really constructive and positive picture about what equity means when it comes to the multilateral space. And so I'm really excited about some of these initiatives that already exist and some that have been proposed, and I hope that this is really a turning point and that these will become reality in the very near future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I see we're at 20 till, and we go another 35 minutes, so I'll try to keep to around 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll have the last half hour for open discussion. As Tom said before, my name is Victor Minotti from the Oakland Institute, but I'm based in Bratislava, Slovakia. I help to coordinate the communications and advocacy for this collective of partners, the Civil Society Equity Review, and also I am a constituency focal point along with Gadir Lavadens in the audience here. Gadir for Demand Climate Justice, if people are familiar with Demand Climate Justice. And so I wanted to start off by taking you back to a year ago in Glasgow. I wasn't there, but watching it online, a lot of you might remember that final floor debate where it exploded over the phase out or phase down of coal and fossil fuels. It turned it into unabated coal and inefficient subsidies, but behind the debate was a growing concern of countries over energy security, access to supplies. Energy prices had already been elevating before. This was 4 or 5 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So governments and companies were already freaking out about fossil fuel supplies and what they call a tightness in the market. So I remind you that the pandemic, prices went down because production went down, demand went down, but as it came roaring back to almost near record demand, supply was still ramping up, and so prices went higher and higher, right? Behind that was probably about a 7 or 8 year trend of what the industry calls underinvestment. That means that investment in fossil fuels had been climbing every year. But since the Paris Agreement, or actually since 2015 when oil prices crashed, there's been less and less of investment in fossil fuels. Now that may sound like a shock to some of you. Sorry, let me say more specifically, less investment in upstream oil and gas, right? So as that supply was growing more slowly, it wasn't keeping up with the rising demand. So you had less what they call spare capacity in the market. That's when investors and producers get nervous and prices start to really go up because it's not clear, people aren't certain if there's going to be more available supply. So not to bore you with market dynamics, but a lot of what our work about keeping it in the ground can't compete with the speak out. A lot of it is, about understanding these market dynamics, and I think the more we understand them, the better we're able to intervene. So what I'm trying to explain is that there is a trend of decreasing investment in the upstream oil and gas, which is great, right? It's the result of more investors being more concerned about climate change. They see the storms, they see the floods, the fires, and so on. They see their kids skipping school to go strike. And prices haven't been that great, and returns haven't been that great for oil and gas, relatively. So that's what's behind the elevated prices that you still have right now. bring on that early March when Russia invaded Ukraine, which compounded this crisis. And I don't want to say it's only that, right? It's also governments had big stimulus in the pandemic, so a lot of demand. Deglobalization is a trend. So many different factors in inflation, but if reading the industry literature, there's growing concern that they are not attracting the investment they want to be able to continue to expand supply, and that's because of the climate crisis, more or less. So how do we manage this? The thing is, we have to, and you're seeing governments not deal with this, right? Every country's trying to figure it out. The UK has been experimenting with different things, mostly to disastrous effect. Some countries in the South that are feeling it, part of the downfall of the government in Sri Lanka was helped to be brought on like this. Certainly Egypt is having trouble. Every country is having trouble with elevated prices. In the U.S., even the election, the midterm elections, which just concluded, was really hanging on the question of gas prices too. So, but my point is what we need is what we're not getting right now. Right now, governments are competing with each other to try to bring down prices or elevate prices, right? Oil producers want prices to be as high as they can. You look at Saudi Arabia or some of the others, and their entire economies are built around one commodity and exporting it. High percentage of their government revenue, almost all the employment, all the schools, the hospitals, everything is funded by that one resource. How do those countries do that transition? Well, it's no surprise that they're encouraging higher and higher prices right now because they're trying to finance that transition. But we know if prices are too high, right, they need the high prices. Prices are too high, other countries can't afford, and they derail their transition plans. So my point is we need governments to cooperate to manage the production and the consumption levels so that we have some manageable price stability for all countries to make that transition. It's another mechanism I would put as foremost that in the areas of international cooperation that we need, it's one that's, I think, the priority, and governments, I hope, figure it out at some point rather than trying to do it unilaterally. There's a number of other ones, but just to run through the chapter quickly, and I forgot to hit start on my timer. So I'll give myself a few more minutes here and just name the few other areas. Complementary to governments cooperating to manage price stability is going to be governments cooperating to reduce demand for fossil fuels, use for fossil fuels. If you remember, again, back to Glasgow last year, following that, President Biden had a meeting with President Xi of China. And the big issue was, what are they going to do about these high runaway energy prices? Well, their response was to cooperate to increase supply, to release more supply of fossil fuels onto the market and try to bring the prices down. Well, that's exactly the opposite what we need to do, right? They only looked at one side of the market equation, increasing supply. The other obvious answer is to decrease demand. Of course, that's also what scientists are saying. We need to decrease demand for fossil fuels. So countries can coordinate their plans to decrease their demand. Almost every country is trying to decrease their demand through efficiency, through electric vehicles, through different mitigation programs. But they could be better coordinated and communicated to producer countries so that they can plan their transition and their own wind down of their production, because they should see the market signals that the consuming nations, their big customers, are switching to something else and no longer going to buy their products. We know it's happening over time. This is not immediate, but it gives those countries the time and the foresight to be able to plan their own reduction in production. Another associated with that is diversification of economies. This other parts of the report cover this a little bit, but countries, particularly the Gulf countries and others who are dependent on fossil fuels, almost all of them are trying to diversify their economies into non-oil, non-gas, but what are they going to do? That's the big question that they face. What sort of international support is there available for them? Financing, access to technology, capacity building. There's really no mechanism under this convention or anywhere for them to be able to access those things. You do have the international IRENA, the renewable energy, but it's not really geared to the needs of those countries and on a timeline and resourced in the way that they need it. So you do need part of a mechanism, an international mechanism, will be to help countries do that diversification. I talked about reducing demand. I'll mention also just closing climate risk, getting the price right. Already investors are demanding more disclosure of carbon risk in their investments, but we need a more, what am I going to say, concrete process that turns into policy that allows producers to predict how they can phase down their production. And then the last one is just to say that international cooperation to plan the phase down, right? It's also said at several other points in the report that the biggest countries who got the wealthiest on the fossil fuels need to go fastest and first in phasing down their production. So the US, the UK, Canada, Norway, these are the ones that need to lead it, and these are the ones that need to provide the most cooperation to other countries that have more trouble in their transition. So I'll turn it back to Tom, and sorry I took closer to 10 minutes, but, or actually I think it goes on now to Liddy now for the final chapter.
You hear me? It's very difficult to compete with that. But we all know that there are many huge structural conditions and problems that constrain immediate, medium-term, and long-term climate action, including the rapid, equitable, and just transition out of fossil fuels. And many of these huge problems are barely discussed within the climate negotiations, and even not hardly enough discussed among climate campaigners. And here we are talking about addressing the inequitable relations between and within countries, the flaws of the international financial system, the neoliberal economic dogma and narrow economic growth models, the power and impunity of transnational corporations, the flaws of existing economic and financial governance arrangements, and even the structure and orientation of southern domestic economies, which are largely legacies of colonization. In Chapter 6, we are saying that international cooperation is needed to address these structural constraints, which includes changing the structures, relations, institutions, and rules in finance, in trade and investments, and in technology. And these are absolutely vital requirements for climate, environmental, economic, social, and gender justice. It was not possible to cover all the major issues in this Chapter 6, and we do aim to follow up this report with more substantive discussions later in the coming years. In Chapter 6, we do, however, cover an overview of the issues and long-standing civil society demands on the following topics. Debt justice. And on debt justice, there are at least two minimum demands from civil society: the total and unconditional cancellation of debts of all the South, of all the countries who need it, and global, transparent, democratic debt workout mechanisms to address unsustainable and illegitimate debt which are not dominated by creditors, unlike existing mechanisms. We also cover international tax justice. And there are at least two demands that have been long been campaigning by tax justice campaigns and movements, and that is a UN tax convention and a UN global tax body. We also cover systemic changes needed in the international financial system, and we're talking largely about the need for strong regulation at the minimum, regulation of capital and financial flows, including short-term capital flows, and transparency in this international financial flows. The report also covers the need for systemic changes in trade and investments, in international trade and investments, and we are focusing especially on trade-related intellectual property rights regime, or the TRIPS, and investor-state dispute mechanisms, or what is known as ISDS. And we are reiterating here the long-time advocacy for broad and comprehensive waiver of TRIPS to include not just COVID vaccine treatments, health, and so on, but also for the international fossil fuel phase-out process, that of renewable energy technologies. We also mention here the long-time advocacy for dismantling of investor-state dispute mechanisms, which have been very much biased in favor of private capital and private corporations. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sure it's been a long, painful process to listen to us while we have that background beautiful noise, nonetheless. So I turn it over to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you all for sitting here with us in this lovely cacophony, but sometimes trying. And so obviously the question is, has the pattern emerged? Have we made our point, which is that there is no end to ways forward from the perspective of building robust international cooperation? And if we haven't made our point, what would we have to do to make our point? And does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to add? If not, I will ask a question, but please, does anybody? Okay, so here then I will ask a question to provoke a little discussion among the panel. Given the fact that we've probably made 35 suggestions for how to increase international cooperation towards laying a robust foundation for a fair climate transition. Which ones are the priorities? Which one? I mean, we're all adults here. We know we can't have everything all at once. Which are the moves that would create enough trust and momentum to move forward at pace? Does anybody on the panel like to, and I'm going to ask nobody on the panel to propose more than one idea. I'm going to ask, does anybody have one thing that they would like to distill from their presentation as a priority? Go.
Did you say 1 minute? Thinking like an organizer, community organizer, but like on a global level, like you got to start with where your constituency is, right? What are they thinking about? What's their priority? That's why I think price stability, and particularly energy price inflation, is the priority issue. It's the one I'm always thinking about. Governments are desperate for solutions. They don't know what to do. I think that it's the basis of cooperation is just beginning a forum to talk about, rather than the backroom deals of the White House trying to talk to who they know in OPEC. Yeah, that's the basic. Sorry, yeah.
I would say the priority is finance. I mean, unless we fund the transition, it can't happen. there are countries that are dependent on fossil fuels just to be able to provide basic services to their citizens. And unless we support those countries, they are locked into continued production of fossil fuels in order to feed their debt, in order to provide basic services, in order to develop. So I think a multilateral, transparent process for funding the transition is a priority.
This is great. Let's go down the line. Christian, one thing.
I have to agree with Rebecca. It's just nothing more important. But I would maybe add a little bit so I don't just pop out.
Go.
So like, I think they're like, I'm interested in some sort of like a discovery mechanism where you can, well, where it's not just finance, but you actually know what type of finance and how much you need for what specifically, instead of just having like a big number. And so we mentioned earlier the Standing Committee on Finance need assessment report. I think that's a step in the right direction. These kind of things where countries actually from the ground up tell, I guess, the world what they need for what and these sort of things. So, but then that's a futile exercise if you cannot expect ever to have anything that comes even close to. So. I'm reminded of Ivo de Boer's statement at some point. He said, "What's the point of taking your Nama to an empty watering hole?" And so that is the same thing. So this exercise only makes sense if there's any reasonable expectation to actually have any of those needs met. Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 votes for finance. Liddy?
You know me, I would vote for finance too. I would just have to agree with that. I think that full delivery of new, additional, public, and non-debt creating finance from the global north to the global south is going to mean, first, it will really give the transition a huge push. And it will start building trust and confidence across nations. And that's a very important step for equity.
As you've heard throughout this panel, international cooperation is necessary for so much, but as a South African, I also don't want to let my government off the hook with the idea that waiting for finance is good enough, because there is also so much that our governments in the global south can do already to prioritize a transition, and that includes redirecting subsidies from the fossil fuel industry into our local economies, cutting extractive multinational deals that pull all of our resources and our profits overseas only to re-import them backwards. The net financial flows from global south to global north are 2 trillion each year. I want to start there.
Yeah. Sindra?
Well, I have the pleasure of going last in this list and still saying finance. So, but I also agree with Colin that the conditions on the ground need to be conducive to the challenge ahead as well, and need to be aligned with equity. And saying finance, I think when we're sitting in this multilateral process, where we're sitting today, we need to see a balance in finance, we need to see balance with adaptation, and we definitely need to see loss and damage finance. So we need finance to address loss and damage, and we need equity in mechanisms and instruments as well.
Would anybody in the audience like to have their say? Assad?
Test?
I said, if I was on the panel, I'd probably say revolution, which means building the power of people, is probably the biggest thing that we would actually need. But I was going to ask the panel just what their thoughts are. I mean, we're fundamentally, when we talk about international cooperation and the elements, we are talking about restructuring a global economy, right? And I was wondering what your take in that was about the idea of degrowth in the global north to be able to recognize the crisis in terms of breaching other planetary limits, not simply the carbon one, but the materials one as well, in terms of resource use for the new economy that we want to build.
I'm going to call on myself. I think we cannot stabilize the planetary climate system without progressive global taxation. And I believe that that progressive global taxation would have to be structured in such a way as to target the rich, whether they live in the North or the South. Now, of course, in this bubble, the UNFCCC bubble, we're only dealing with nation-to-nation relationships. So obviously, we have to talk about the countries where the rich gather. And that is largely the global north countries, of course, but that's my answer to the question.
Could I come in on that, Tom?
Sure.
Just to support that and to elaborate on a little bit about how it could work and how I think, like, okay, how do you do taxation like that? Again, looking to the energy elevated prices, the reaction of governments has been, like I said, increased supply, or even these windfall taxes. There's a proposal in the UK, there's a proposal in the US, but I understand that at least what Biden would do, and I think also the UK, is they would incentivize supply, more production, right? Biden would say, we're going to put a windfall tax on you unless you increase production, which was like, we don't need more of it, right? We need less. What though, if we instead focus on the highest income, highest carbon activities, right? Like business travel, or since the pandemic in the US, now 1/4 of the airplanes in the air are private business executive jets. People don't want to, those who are wealthy don't want to fly commercial anymore. So private executive jets, that's a huge use of carbon. Or the whole commercialization of space that's taken off, Jeff Bezos style. Or cryptocurrency, very intensive with fossil fuels and production. So there are a number of activities that are associated with high net worth, high income, and high carbon use. And we want to, if we're going to target demand, you can't do it across, we got to be careful because you'll get, like you saw in France a few years ago with the yellow vests, right? If you raise prices for everybody, working people they won't tolerate it. So, but if we go after the folks who are able to afford it and who won't even feel it, okay, maybe they got to pay, what is it? I think I heard the Virgin Air, it's like they're selling trips now to go around, go into space basically. And it's, I think, $450,000 to get on that first rocket ship that they're going to do. What if they had like another 100,000 per person, maybe a 10% ad, just like wrapping it up. We got a little time here, but the point is to make the rich pay and the ones who are burning the most carbon. That's how you build political support right now for it.
I'd like to say something too. Of course, I agree with global progressive taxation, wealth taxes for climate, for instance. But Assad was asking about degrowth. Taxes is actually after the fact. You still have the problem of overproduction and the pursuit of high growth. And certainly, we need degrowth in the north, but that's not complete there. We also have inequalities in the north. So it has to be degrowth and redistribution so that the problem is addressed more squarely. But Farouk, we are already waging revolution.
I think redistribution of wealth means really a mass level participation of the working class. who should take over the state and then go for these reforms. These rich people, for instance, in Pakistan, Imran Khan lives in 300 canals of home, and Nawaz Sharif and Shehbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister, lives in 1600 canal of home. So one person in 300 canal. So they are like kings, they are like royalties. So they are not really anything to do with us, as our friend Victor just said, that 1/3 of the flights are just these executives. So they have a total different life than ours. And that has to be absolutely changed through a revolution, not just without that. Thank you.
So I'm tempted to wrap it up at this point, because we're talking about revolution, you know.
We can do it in a whisper.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for thinking this through with us. You know, I guess the last thing I want to say is that this COP is a COP at which someone speaking at the high table has proposed a global tax, right? And I think even though we're all tired of this process, which has been going on for a very long time, I think we should recognize that this may in fact be a possibility of a turning point. It may be that things in this process are going to get more serious going forward. And if they do, we'll have to think about cooperation at every level. And so I think I'm going to just leave it at that unless someone wants to chime in again. Okay?